To that end, we had a number of conversations, including, again, with other world leaders, but in particular with President Macron. I talked about a number of issues, and I'll outline several of them. The issue of global health. Of course, one of the most pressing challenges that all nations are facing. As you know, the first visit that we made upon landing, essentially in Paris, was to go to the Institut Pasteur. Of course, I also have a personal sense of connection to that place. My mother did research there. But what is most significant is that the relationship between the scientists and the scientific research that has taken place in France has often been in collaboration with scientists around the world, including the United States. In fact, when we were at the Pasteur Institute, we will recall that it was in 1961 that mRNA was developed, which of course was not only the basis for the work that we talked about in terms of the advances in breast cancer, but the basis for the vaccine that is now saving lives around the globe. We talked about the pandemic in the context of global health, in the context of our need to prepare for the next pandemic, and what our two nations have a moral obligation and responsibility to do in terms of not only addressing the public health needs of our own citizens, but participating with our friends around the globe, and in particular, those that are most vulnerable and most in need. You'll recall yesterday, one of the panels, world leaders, talked specifically about the disparities and inequities in terms of vaccine distribution around the world. That was a priority for our discussions while we were here. The issue of space. Well, I, of course, chair the Space Council for the United States. But when we look at the opportunities that are presented by space exploration, they are vast. President Macron and I talked specifically about the partnership and the ongoing partnership that the United States and France have had as it relates to emerging technologies and how they connect to economic security and to national security. And so we had an in-depth conversation about our intention to grow the relationship that we have as it relates to space. And again, that relationship is not only convening the experts and the most talented of our respected nations to engage in ongoing innovation, but also, and critically important, to work together as allies in establishing universal norms around what will be the behaviors in space and how they will be interpreted by all nations. In many ways, when we think about space exploration, it is the next frontier, and we are the leaders in this pursuit. And what we do now, without any doubt, incrementally or expansively, will have a profound impact on where this issue ends up in the years and decades to come. We talked about regional security. Again, the alliance between France and the United States is long-standing on that issue. As we celebrated Armistice Day, Veterans Day, as we went to the American Cemetery here in Paris, we saw symbols of the enduring and long-standing relationship that we have had on that issue. And so we did discuss our partnership as it relates to defense. We did discuss the fact that after World War II, we created a transatlantic alliance based on our mutual understanding about the interconnection and interdependence between the United States, France, and our allies on the issue of security defense. We talked about the Indo-Pacific. As you know, in my last trip, foreign trip, went to Vietnam and Singapore to reestablish the commitment and the enduring commitment that the United States has as a member of the Indo-Pacific to our friends and our partners in that region. One of the most important issues that we have discussed as a current issue in that regard is the challenge that all nations are facing in regard to supply chains. That was a discussion we had here as well. And the discussion was essentially this. One, it is indisputable that all nations have suffered because of the pandemic, predominantly, on the issue of supply chains. Two, that the global demand will not be met, cannot be met by any one nation. And so it requires then, if we are to meet the challenge of supply chain issues, coordination, collaboration, and partnership. So that was part of the discussion we had as it relates to the Indo-Pacific, but also as it relates to a general perspective on an issue that is challenging, and I will speak for the American public, for families every day when folks are trying to think about how they're going to get products they need. Our auto manufacturers concerned about getting critical components, and when families are worried about being able to make sure Santa Claus gets whatever Santa Claus should get to the children by Christmas. We talked about what we will do as it relates to the Sahel, which is a specific region on the continent of Africa. We have a mutual concern there that relates to the ongoing challenges that the countries in the Sahel are facing. Among the many priorities that we share is a concern about what we need to do to address potential violence and ongoing violence. And to that end, we renewed, if there was any doubt, which there was not, our mutual commitment to work with each other on counterterrorism. As you know, at the Paris Peace Forum yesterday, we addressed the growing issue of inequality. Again, something we have been discussing for months, which is that this pandemic, in many ways, has highlighted, has magnified the long-standing, pre-pandemic failures and fractures and fissures in our systems. And so we talked about what we can do together to address these inequities and the inequality that has existed since the beginning of time around the world. I'm particularly excited about the convening and the number of nations that came together to have this conversation and to express a commitment to work more closely with each other, understanding, again, the interdependence and interconnection that we have. And so we talked about inequality and inequity in a number of ways. As you know, I presented what I believe should be an approach to the issue, which is to not simply accept that it has always been, but instead to challenge ourselves to do something about it. And the method by which we can do something about it is to ask, why is it? And then I went through a list. Why is it that a very significant number of women around the world are subjected to sexual and domestic violence? Why is it that we are still seeing children around the globe who are hungry? Why is it that we see that there are certain nations who have the resources that have caused, among many things, them to be some of the greatest emitters of pollution in the world, and others who are responsible for a negligible amount of emissions are taking the greatest brunt? So we have before us, again, in the midst of great challenges, an opportunity when we come together during a week like this, nations around the world, to speak truth, to challenge each other, and to dedicate ourselves, certainly those of us who consider ourselves to be partners and allies, to actually address these issues together, understanding the mutual commitment but the mutual investment. Technology, another of the issues that is a marker of this new era in terms of the influence, the ubiquity, but also the challenges that individuals and nations face because of growing technology. We talked extensively, both in our bilateral but with others, and again yesterday on a stage, about what we as nations must do who have similar values, whose nations were founded on similar principles, to apply those principles and norms to how we will engage with each other and interpret each other's actions as it relates to our use of technology. And of course, cybersecurity being the most obvious point there. Addressing what we have seen in the United States and around the world, the hackers that have compromised systems, ransomware, not to mention the daily abuse of individuals' privacy and manipulation and monetization of other people's data and personal information. So these are some of the conversations that we had on technology. As you know, we also, as the United States, expressed that we will partner in the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. We talked about democratic elections. It's a challenge for all of us on the former topic, which is technology, and again, I talked about that yesterday. It's an issue that President Macron and I talked about it, a mutual concern about how technology can be used to weaken democracies. And in particular, what we have seen in recent times being used specifically to that end to manipulate elections. So we have talked about what we must do together, again, as partners, to address this issue, both in terms of, yes, norms and standards, but also in terms of accountability, including a very important point, which I believe, and I'm pleased to see, that gradually partners and allies are all agreeing should be a norm, which is that there should be attribution when it occurs. That was once a debatable point among nations, but we are seeing that there is a broader consensus, that there must be attribution. We must call it out, to use a colloquial, when we see it. And then we must do something about it, and that is the point about accountability.